If you love our podcast, then I suspect you will be super pleased to join us live. That's right, it's time for our annual No Small Endeavor Live Thanksgiving show. This year we'll be joined by New York Times bestselling author David Brooks with special guests Amy Grant and Sheryl Crow. It's a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mark your calendars for November 24. You will not want to miss this amazing night with some of our all-time favorite guests on the show. Don't wait. Go get your tickets now at nosmallendeavor.com. No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp. This is No Small Endeavor. You're listening to our Unabridged interview with Tim Shriver. Tim is an educator, a director of films, and a best-selling author. He's also been the chairman of the Special Olympics for many, many years. It's an organization which I didn't realize until I started digging into the interview with Tim, that Special Olympics is an organization that Tim's mother, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, founded in their backyard when he was a boy. This is a great interview. I really enjoyed my time with Tim. Very hopeful and beautiful picture of seeking to do good in the world. And support for No Small Endeavor comes from Civis, advancing the common good through investment in cultural activities that tackle pressing social issues and examine our common humanity and interdependent futures. More information can be found at civis.org. That's civis.org. Enjoy, Tim Shriver. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's happy to have you with us. I've been looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
So in your writing of and of course in public American lore, it's no surprise that you grew up in one of the most prominent and storied families in American history. Your mother, the sister of President John F. Kennedy, your grandfather, Joseph P. Kennedy, who worked with President Franklin Roosevelt. Your grandfather was a prominent politician in his own right. And you've also said you grew up with a very clear idea of what it meant to be born into that kind of privilege. So tell us a bit more about that kind of awareness and the family context in which you were raised.
Well, when you're a kid, you don't know that there's different contexts. So the only context, of course, I knew from 0 to 6 or 8 or 10, and until you start to kind of get a feel for the rest of the world, is the one I was growing up in. And the one I was growing up in was mostly steeped in getting out of the house and getting things done. Mostly my mom and my dad. My dad, by the time I was 2 years old, was launching the Peace Corps around the world and bringing Peace Corps volunteers into our house and thinking about what it meant to be a part of a Peace Corps. What was the difference between that and other military corps or diplomatic corps? What did it mean to be doing the work of peace? My dad was mesmerized by that question and challenged young Americans to think about it and live it and live with people in other countries and learn their language and be in their villages and in their neighborhoods and in their places of worship, to understand them, to promote the idea that America was a country that wanted to understand the world. So that was part of my upbringing. My mom, while my dad was doing that in the house, she was out in the backyard teaching children with intellectual disabilities who were coming from institutions at the time, mostly forgotten and abandoned for life, these kids. But in our backyard, they were campers. She started something, she called it Camp Shriver. We had a big backyard in Rockville, Maryland, and she thought, let's have the kids come here. Nobody else wants them. They can come to my house. So she said to one mother, you bring your kids to my house. We'll have activities for them. And her vision, her goal, and was really her whole life's work, was to prove that people with intellectual disabilities had value, had dignity. That the world was not seeing them clearly, was misreading their identities, their value, their gifts, that it was channeling, destroying their value by limiting them to a disability, to a label. So, I grew up in a family, of course, with President Kennedy and then my uncles who were in the United States Senate. There were always big events and campaigns. I mean, there was a presidential campaign in my life, really pretty much every 4 years until one form or another, until I was 21. So politics was a big part of it, but in my house, at least, the politics was small p. It was the work of building the body politic. My mom was recruiting people, not political volunteers. She was recruiting young teenagers to come volunteer to work with kids with special needs. My dad was recruiting college kids and 20 somethings to go live around the world, to live in Africa and Latin America and Asia and come back and tell the story of the rest of the world. So we were, they were builders, creatives, what today we would call social entrepreneurs. Huh. And I guess the one point I'd make, which maybe gets lost sometimes in the story of politics, is how much fun my parents made the work. Huh. It wasn't a duty-bound message, although there was duty. It wasn't a guilt-bound, set of admonitions, although there was a sense of our own privilege. But it was more the idea that from the depths of your being, this is what will give you happiness. To give of yourself, to engage, to challenge yourself, to make the world more just, to build it up.
That's fascinating because you have written about your Roman Catholic family background, and I think maybe it was your grandmother that you said often quoted Luke 12, the parable of the faithful servant, that has this line, "To whom much is given, much is expected." But I hear you saying that there is this kind of sense of responsibility, but it's always coupled with a sort of integrity with delight in some way.
Yeah, much is expected sounds like you owe a lot back. But I think there's another meaning, at least in my life. The much was the overflowing nature of the gifts we've been given and the overflowing nature of the opportunity to participate in the sharing of them. It wasn't just like, you've got 3 cheeseburgers, give away 2. It was more like you've got a lot, bring the world in, we got we have this big backyard. My mom was like, look, it's outrageous that we have this big backyard and no one plays in it. I mean, you look at it, a yard, and, one person might think, wow, it's so nice. We have this exclusive space. Her vision was, what a disaster if there aren't people playing in this yard. So there was, there's a faith-based traditions sometimes, I think, get falsely pigeonholed as, a series of moral admonitions. You should do this. You should think this. You should be this way. You should, you call it shoulding on people, should. I don't want to say my parents didn't have some of that. I mean, we are Catholic. I mean, there's plenty of moral, there's plenty of guilt and there's plenty of moral admonitions in Catholicism in the tradition. But there's also this sense in which the stirring, of the inner life invites a certain expression of connection to others and a hunger to change things. It's not just a requirement, it's a hunger. It's like, wow, I want to live in a world. I think about this a lot with Special Olympics. People come to games, maybe they come to help. Maybe they come to volunteer. Maybe they come because the kids, maybe they need me. I'm going to be a good person. They deserve a chance. I'm going to help them. But most of the time, they leave thinking, I want to live in that world. Like, that's the world I want to be a part of. I want to be a part of a world where everybody gets cheered for, when they try. I want to be a part of the world where there's no hierarchy here. Like, everybody's being brave in the attempt. And when people want to win, of course, and there's cheering and there's high-fiving, there's no spite, there's no hostility, there's no dehumanization. No one's on the side of the track vanquished or destroyed by the competition. Everyone's lifted. So anyway, I don't know. That was kind of the way it felt to me as a kid. Like, join this. This is the sweet spot of life.
Huh. Yeah, that's beautiful. You, in your book, Fully Alive and Discovering What Matters Most, you talk a lot about your Aunt Rosemary as perhaps one of the people in your family who have may have had the most influence on you. Can you tell us about her?
Well, Rosemary, I mean, my mom's family, my mom is well known for her work in launching the Special Olympics movement. But the people who really are known around the world are President Kennedy, her brother, my uncle Bobby Kennedy and his work, and as part of his brother's administration, and then as a candidate for president himself in 1968, my uncle Ted Kennedy. Those are the people whose reputations, people say, well, what was it like? Or do you remember the president? Do you remember Senator Kennedy? Don't you admire? I admire your uncle so much. That's what gets the attention. But right in the picture, next to all of them, is my Aunt Rosemary, and she was born with an intellectual disability. And all those boys, in that case, and my mom and her sisters, they all grew up with Rosemary in the house. Now, I asked my Uncle Ted, and towards the end of his life, my mother, we talked about this quite a lot. What effect did Rosemary have? She never wrote a book. She never gave a speech. She never got elected to anything. She never made a great investment on Wall Street. She never was the belle of the ball. She never sat in the front row seats at the ball game, stuff like that. She never did any of that stuff. All the things that the boys and the more competitive siblings did, she didn't do any of it. And yet, my view is that it was the leaven she placed into the system, into that family system. The leaven that said, when we give ourselves to Rosemary, you know what, we get something beautiful back. The moments in which I think all of those 8 siblings saw in her a cause that was worthy of changing the world. They knew that the world couldn't see their sister. And when your sister's cool and beautiful and wonderful and deserving, and no one else sees it, imagine. That's the experience of so many siblings. I know my sister, my brother, has value, has made a difference in my life, has contributions. No one sees it. What's going on here? Why don't you see my sister? And I can hear the echoes of that emotion in the politics of my uncles and certainly in the work of my mom. See this, give of yourself. Remember these words. Don't ask what's going to come your way. Ask what you can give. Where did he learn that? And it's just a theory. I don't have, I'm not a historian, and I don't see my family through the eyes of history or those kinds of things. I see it personally. But I think he learned how to come to his great moment, his inaugural address, and invite Americans to give of themselves. I think he learned that from his sister Rosemary more than he learned it from any other person. My grandparents, when Rosemary was born, most people who had means would have put their child into an institution for life and forgotten about it. That's what the doctor said. Forget about her. Move on. You have other children. She'll be taken care of. And that would have been the end of ever knowing about or seeing or learning from Rosemary. But my grandparents made this, in my view, quite life-changing decision. They said, no, we're keeping our daughter at home. She's going to stay with us. There's no school for her. We'll find something. There's no doctor. We'll go looking. There's no church. We'll ask the sisters and priests in our tradition to make some accommodation. There's no transportation. There's no work. We'll find it. And they just kept, there's no research. We'll try to support it. They were determined that their daughter would somehow get a chance, and that her brothers and sisters would be part of changing the world for Rosemary. Mm-hmm. And to me, that made all the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say at one point, it would take me 20 years to come to understand that the biggest beneficiary of my attempt to make a difference for others would be me. And even more remarkably, I would learn along the way that the most powerful role models in my search would not be the mighty and the beautiful whom I had been raised to try to outdo, but instead the vulnerable and the forgotten on the edge of life whom I had been raised to help. That's a beautiful, beautiful reflection.
Thank you.
Before we leave childhood and family, I do find it kind of hard to comprehend. I would think for you as a boy, and you said earlier that is kind of the context in which you're raised. You don't really know any different, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's this sort of I would assume, I don't know, I would assume that there's a sort of perhaps emotional or psychological weight of it all. That is, here you are in one of the most prominent families in American history, a strong expectation that you'll do something worthwhile with your life, even if it is, as you said, suffused in this beautiful way with delight. And the impact that it might have had upon a boy to have, two of his uncles killed in most perhaps globally known assassinations of the day. And so my question in all that is, coming out of that, as you've unpacked the heritage that you were given, the expectations that you were given, what's it been like for you to kind of unpack that psychologically, emotionally? What are things you've had to learn about how to be free, how to be free in the midst of all that, as opposed to burdened? What's that kind of look like for you? Or maybe it hasn't been a thing that you've had to negotiate very much.
Well, no, it's definitely been a thing I've had to negotiate. You've brought up a couple of different points, high expectations, some degree, so at least surrounding me, of fame and notoriety, violence, profound disruption, destabilizing violence, and of course, you try to make sense of all those things when you're 4 or 10 or 12 or 14. Retrospect, I think I really kind of came out of my childhood really wanting to understand grief. I think, my mom in particular was grief-stricken probably her whole life. Can't blame her. That's not a mistake. That's just a condition. And I think there was enormous sadness in my grandparents. They lost a son in World War II. They lost a daughter shortly, around the same time, plane crash. Young people in their 20s in the prime of life. Rosemary, my aunt, who I mentioned earlier, had a terrifically damaging and debilitating operation that went awry around the same time, and then to lose a son in the prime of his life to assassin. There was just a lot of grief, a lot of what we would today call trauma. So I think I wondered, and I think I still wonder, what do you do with grief? I can't remember who said it, but someone said, if you get grief wrong, you get a lot of things wrong. And it always sort of struck me like, well, what does it mean to get grief right? What's that look like? Just move on. That's one version, particularly faith-based people have, everybody's in heaven, don't worry. Didn't quite work for me. Revenge, that didn't seem to make any sense. Who's I going to be? Who are we going to get for having done all this to us? There was nobody to get. At least it didn't seem to me that way. So you're kind of left as a kid watching your parents, watching others around you, feeling your own sense of, whoa, this is chaos. Like, this is not safe. It's not safe around here. Wondering, what do you do with not safe? And I think so that's the questions. I wouldn't say the answer, but the experience that struck me, when I was in my 20s, was the experience that really came not so much out of the traditional religious teachings, but out of the spiritual or the mystical experiences. These people, these men and women over the centuries, I started to read in my 20s, who had navigated, who in effect become experts at how you metabolize things inside you. How you find your own center, how you find silence, how you find emptiness. When you find emptiness, what do you experience in that emptiness? Is there such a place as the place where there is no thing? And if you can touch the place of no thing, what is there? Is it peace? Is it love? Is it zero? Is it emptiness? I suppose most importantly here, the more I started to practice these, I would say almost ancient arts, silence, breathing, and self-emptying. These come from all the traditions. People think of them as Eastern, and they are rich in the Eastern traditions, and Buddhism in particular. But they're also rich in Christianity and like rich in Judaism too, and Islam. Uh, uh, it started to make a little more sense to me that the flow here is much larger than my little narrative. And that the losses and the gains of life are being held in a larger force field. And it's not just a force field I can name as Jesus or as, Allah or whatever. It's a force field that I can feel and touch and invite into my life in a very intimate and personal way. And that work, that inner work, I guess is what we'd call it today, has helped me quite a lot to not to overcome grief, but to, I guess, understand its constitutive role. I mean, in the end of the day, we all have it. Yeah. And if there is a God, God obviously created whatever it is we're experiencing to include loss. And so what is it teaching us about the larger flow? What is it teaching us about? In the Christian tradition, we talk about, death and resurrection as though they happened 2,000 years ago. What if there's a death and resurrection right now? What if letting go of what you're clinging to now is part of rebirthing who you can be in this moment? I mean, these are maybe sounding crazy and esoteric, so forgive me if they do, but this has been my work to try to understand my childhood.
Yeah. So you went on to do a master's degree at Catholic University in reading the mystics. Do you think that when you were doing that, when you made the decision to do that, you had some sort of awareness that you are processing what it means to grieve?
Well, I knew I'd already started as a teacher in New Haven, Connecticut, teaching kids from low income and very oppressed, is the language we'd use today, communities. I already knew that, teaching them history and teaching them science, it just wasn't working. I mean, they were asking much more fundamental questions. Like, why should I bother? Like, that was a question I didn't know how to answer. I was 23. Why should I bother doing my homework, Mr. Shriver? It's like, well, you'll go to college. You could someday, buy a nice car and, you could pay the rent or buy a house all those answers sort of made sense, but I could see the kids just looking at me like, are you kidding me? Stop it. Like, that's a lie. Why are you lying to me? Like, first of all, they had no evidence that was going to work. And they had no evidence that they're buying into social studies or, how to punctuate a sentence was going to make any difference in their lives. So they were asking me like big questions, and I was like realizing I was asking big questions, and I was thinking, so I studied child development for a year before I went to study the mystics, and I was fascinated by psychological the insights of psychoanalysis, the insights of medical psychopharmacology. I was studying at the Yale Child Studies Center, all this stuff. And I had this conversation with one of the things they let the young students do where I was like, I don't know, 24, 25, is I took the director of the Child Studies Center and he said, well, you don't have time. He doesn't have time to meet with you, but you can drive him to a speaking engagement. So I drove Dr. Al Solon, a genius, brilliant man, so kind, so generous with his vision, great author. We drove to an event, and I think it was in Hartford, and I drove the car, and I drove him back. And I was talking to him on the way back, and I was like, Dr. Solon, my students are looking for meaning. Like, what do I do? How do I help them? And he said, well, ask them questions that help them open up and try to create a zone of no judgment and invite them to explore more deeply their childhood. I said, yeah, no, I think that's great. That's great. But they want real meaning. Like, how would you define meaning, Dr. Solnit? And he said to me, well, there's no meaning in psychology. there's the meaning of your experience, like what did the experience mean to you, but there's no larger meaning. And I thought, okay, I got to go somewhere else. I got to go somewhere else because that's not enough for me. I'm going to find someone who does have some insights into ultimate meaning. And that's what led me to the mystics. It's funny, because people wouldn't think of Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud or Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow or people I was studying at the time, Maria Montessori in the education space, or I was studying all these folks in the mental health space. And then I started reading, Meister Eckhart and Dionysius the Areopagite and, Julian of Norwich. And I thought, man, these people are right. They're in the same field, they're talking the same language. They bring different views and different insights to the exploration of the inner life, but all these people are really profoundly gifted at helping us to see the work we have to do inside to find the space that allows us to connect more fully. So I don't know whether it was a perfectly planned pattern, but it worked for me.
In just maybe 2 to 3 sentences, if you had to summarize, if you come out of that conversation of being told there is no meaning as such, and you say, well, I need more than that. And so you go read the Mystics for a couple of years. What kind of answer to the question that you had posed to the professor there at Yale did you get from your reading the Mystics?
Well, it's good. I'm glad you say 2 or 3 sentences. Here's the one sentence answer. Within each of us is a shrine of ultimate holiness. Bernard Lonergan calls it the spark in our clod, our native orientation toward the divine. He writes about this as a thinker about cognitional theory, meaning that our desire to know is in fact evidence of our hunger for ultimate knowledge. That we seek not just what is practically workable, but what is true. And that our desire to do good is not just a proximate quest, it's our desire to actually find the good. So his point would be within you. I mean, even when you look around the room and say, I don't like the colors in here, there's something in that thought that is an arc towards the ultimate. What is real beauty? I want real beauty in this. I don't just want this. I want something beautiful here, right? I just don't want to know the answer to Tim's question. I want to know the answer to the question. And people listening to this may go, oh, that worked for him. It doesn't work for me. I get it. Search. That's the spark. That's the source of meaning, ultimate meaning. It's not an answer, but it is a question that everyone can touch. If they just ask themselves, how am I feeling, thinking? What is my hunger for? What do I seek? That wasn't 3 sentences, sorry, but it was.
Yeah, no, that's really lovely. I mean, it reminds me of an experience I had at the end of my first year of being a college professor, and I went to an older colleague, and I was talking about how just this kind of sense of self-questioning and self-doubt, and wondering if I had really taught my students anything. And my colleague, who has become a dear friend, he said something like, it may be, Lee, that if you can give your students better questions to take with them the rest of their lives, that may be one of the most important things you could do. And so I hear you similarly in a parallel but different track saying, pay attention to the questions that we're asking, and there may be in that very act of question asking and asking good questions a profound way to think about, one way to think about the meaning of our lives. Yeah, that's lovely.
I think so, and I think that the one point that the spiritual teachers would make is explore your own questions. Like, don't just look for what's the meaning of the environment or all the important things we do with it. What's the meaning of education, or what's the meaning of being a parent? Really important questions. Those tend to have their data outside of us. I can read 100 parenting books, and I can actually maybe get better at parenting. I don't know if I would, but maybe I would, or 100 books on virtue and get better at understanding virtue, or 100 books on auto mechanics and become a better mechanic, or, you can go down the list. There's another data set, and the data is us. It's our own consciousness and how we are experiencing, how we are understanding, how we are making judgments, how we are deciding to act, that data is equally powerful. In fact, in some ways, more powerful to explore and to ask questions of. And I think that's where, in some ways, like we hear a lot, maybe you hear it a lot as you teach from young people who they don't want religion. They want spirituality sometimes. They're spiritual but not religious. That's a growing group. But what I think they're really saying is they want to explore the terrain of the inner life, not just the writings of the external, much more conceptual world of religion, which I think is great. I think it's great. It doesn't mean you have to throw out religion. It just means that within religion, they don't find food for the inner life. And if they don't find it there, then I think religious institutions have to own their responsibility for figuring out how to give it.
So also in your early career as an educator, you began, you're instrumental in creating the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which has become a significant trend in American education. So could you kind of give us a quick snapshot on what social and emotional learning is?
It's just exactly what we just said. I mean, look, I was talking to kids and they were asking questions about themselves, about people around them, about meaning, about purpose, about belonging. Do I fit anywhere? Am I important to anybody? Does any of it really matter? So, if you're asking those questions and people are telling you to do your homework, you don't do such a good job. Because you're like, I don't really care about my homework. I want to. So we a group of us decided that there was a whole field of education, which was how to pull out the emotional and the social connection that kids are starving for in order to make them more motivated learners of academics. So we want kids to learn the periodic table. We want kids to learn how to analyze a poem. We want kids to learn the dates of the Civil War. But in this day and age, to enable them to do that, they've got to feel safe and they've got to feel wanted and they've got to feel that they matter. Full stop. That's just basic child development science. So we said, well, who's teaching that? And the answer was, well, good teachers teach it. Like you just get it when you get it. And we said, that's not good enough. There's a lot of us who aren't such great teachers. We need a field. We need skills to teach these kinds of things. So we called the field originally social development. How can we help kids develop socially? Then there was a big group of people who were interested in emotional intelligence and emotional development. So we came together and we said, well, let's call it social and emotional learning. And let's actually start to look at how schools can methodically do that better. It's not that schools weren't doing it. It's just that there was no method. There was no strategy. There was no conference you could go to, no book you could read, no research analysis you could find that would say, oh, this is better than that, like phonics versus whole language. You could study how to teach reading, but you couldn't study how to teach purpose or how to teach self-regulation or how to teach helping people find a way to listen more deeply to their peers and to feel listened to. So that's the field we started. We said, let's start a field. Let's call it social and emotional learning. And it's not going to replace academics, obviously not. It's going to help academics, but we're going to actually try to build a kind of a community of people who want to do this and want to do it well. I like to say it's not whether or not schools do social and emotional issues, whether they address them. It's just whether they address them well. Because every school has a social and emotional dimension. It's just whether it's doing a good job or not. Right. We have to ask ourselves. So that's the field we created. We put together a little organization, but the organization's small by comparison with the field. We just did a study the other day. Rand actually did a study I think it's over 80% of schools and teachers now see themselves as implementing some form of dedicated focus on social and emotional learning, which I think is great. It doesn't mean we're there. We have a lot of work to do to improve quality and to address lots of issues in the field. But all that it's about is back to this basic insight, which is how do you bring the inner life, the questions of the inner life more thoroughly and fully to the classroom so that kids will be connected to the teachers they're learning from and hungry to learn what the schools have to offer.
Yeah. Does
that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it's very compelling. And I think about I was a great student. That was in my perfectionism. That was one of the ways I felt okay about myself because I did well in school all the way through. But I didn't have the opportunity to learn things that I would call practical wisdom that relate to relationships, or practical wisdom that relates to thinking about the meaning of one's life until I'm in my 30s and my 40s. And so I can just see how immensely helpful that kind of work could be in elementary school, middle school, high schools. It's an exciting possibility. Are there any particular case studies or stories that you've heard through the years that make you think, yeah, that's what we were trying to do?
So this isn't a case study, but I was visiting a school just maybe 2 months ago, outside of Chicago, and they're doing a lot of work in this field. And the principal was there, and he brought in 6 students, 3rd and 4th and 5th graders, and they were each put on their seats, and a group of us adults were there to listen. And they each talked about, I learned social emotional learning in my sports team, and it makes us better teammates. And I learned it in my literature class, and we use it to study the characters. And there's one kid at the end gave his little talk. And then at the end, it was like, okay, now we have to move on to the next thing. And the kid says, no, I want to say one more thing. And the teacher was a little bit like, let's rush through it. And the kid was like, no, I want to say one more thing. And so everybody's like, okay, he wants to say one more thing. And he says, there's a word that makes me mad. And he kind of paused, and I said, I can't remember what it is. And then he he started to think through, and he said, I tell you, the word that makes me mad is autism. It makes me mad, and makes me sad. Autism. And he's kind of winced like that, and he goes, it's okay to be mad and sad. He says, you can't throw a chair when you're mad and sad. But for me, when I feel mad and sad, I like to get a hug. That was the end. Now, here's the thing, Lee. If you listen to that little exploration, to me, that is Nobel Prize level social and emotional intelligence.
Indeed.
There's something that bothers me. I don't know what it is. It's everybody's experience. But he then takes the time to explore. He digs a little bit, and then he locates the spot. He names it, the word, and then he points out that it has multiple levels of emotional valence.
Yeah.
It's not just one feeling. There's 2.
Right.
And then he names his options about what to do to meet the need he feels when he's mad and sad. And he knows that part of him wants to throw a chair, and another part of him wants a hug. Completely different reactions, right? And completely different range of options. And he's decided at the age of 12 how to pick which choice to make when those complex feelings are triggered by this condition or by this word. Now, that's just one kid.
Yeah.
I can't tell you I have a randomized controls trial that says that that's more likely, but I can tell you when I heard him give his small little experience, I thought to myself, if we can educate a generation of children to have even half of that wisdom about their inner lives, how much more healthy they would be for themselves. He's just a better student because he can do this.
Right.
But listen to those kids around him watching.
Yeah.
And learning from him and seeing how the world works through his eyes, and maybe how it can work more. I just thought to myself, like, wow, let's just, wow.
That is a wow, beautiful moment. I mean, it also strikes me thinking about, as you said earlier, your father doing all this work in the inviting college students into the Peace Corps, and this sort of work of sowing ways of peace in the world. And what you're doing there with these school kids is a similar sort of sowing of the seeds of the possibility of peacemaking, because now all of a sudden those emotions don't have to come out sideways and create all sorts of hostility. So that's really beautiful. So when you at some point you began working as the chair of the Special Olympics, and then oversee that growing one of its largest expansions in the organization of its history. This kind of comes out of your backyard, right? And then it begins growing from there. What was it like for you to come back to that work, and what were some of the things that have been important to you in that endeavor?
Well, I think the main thing, I got to go all over the world. I probably went 15, maybe 20 times to China to work with the government and different civil society leaders there, business leaders, and expanding disability rights and services and inclusive practices in China. But I did the same. I was in Syria. I've been in Lebanon. I've been in Malawi and South Africa. I've been in Peru and Ecuador. And it's just been an enormous privilege to be able to see how there's such a hunger in humanity to do things that help. There's so many people. It's not just Americans. I mean, we're beautiful people, but it's not just us. Our species is starving, searching. And if you give people a chance and show them a path and let them, exercise the muscle of goodness and compassion and openness and trust, we'll do it. We will, not all of us, of course, but most of us will take the chance. So that's been enormously powerful. I think the big insight, from my point of view, at least, has been that the athletes, who, as I said in that day selection, you said the athletes who we all most of us come to help, turn into these enormously, for me, powerful teachers. I mean, when you see a Special Olympics athlete run her race, from start to finish, 12 years old, maybe she has Down syndrome, maybe she's never been invited to a birthday party, maybe their school didn't want her, maybe she didn't meet any developmental milestone on time, so her mom or her dad had to listen to the doctor say she's behind, speech isn't perfect, not texting. And she shows up at the starting line nonetheless. She runs that damn race with everything she's got, and whether she comes in first or fourth, she's cheering, her mom is cheering, love is pouring out of her, love is pouring into her. I think to myself, that's freedom. Not the volunteer who's helping, not me who's watching. That is a human being liberated from the stigma and judgment and need to control and need to have approval and need to be in charge and need to be prominent, and free of that, So I just feel like I've been able to learn something. It's almost like a ritual. It's almost like I go back over and over again to be reminded, like in prayer or in meditation or even if you're a writer, you have to have a ritual, right? You have to practice writing. If you're a doctor, what does a doctor do? Practices medicine. So I feel like you have to practice freedom. And my practice is reconnecting to the athletes of Special Olympics and trying to listen below the level of the noise, below the level of the words that might not fit perfectly together, below the level of the different way of pronouncing things, or maybe not speaking at all. Listen still, you can still listen. And oftentimes I find in the presence of these athletes, the invitation to live life much more hopefully, much more freely. I think that's, the reason I'm so excited about the Special Olympics movement today is because I think that's the lesson so many kids are hungry for. Like, how do I live free of all this noise, all this contempt, all this hostility?
Yeah, you at one point quote a mother of a Special Olympics athlete who said, "I wouldn't change my son for the world, but I would change the world for my son," which I think is pointing to that dynamic you're describing. Yeah.
I think everybody would like to change the world in order to make it safer for each of us. And I think Special Olympics athletes are like that. If you want to know how to change it, watch them. I mean, you could say watch your politicians, or you could say watch, scholars, You'd say watch organizers or writers, but I say, don't don't knock on my door. Go down to your local. This Saturday, I don't care when you're listening to this. This Saturday, there's a Special Olympics event, probably within 20 miles of where you're living. There's a track meet, there's a fall games, there's a soccer tournament, there's a bowling championship. Just go down and watch for 20 minutes. If you want to know what the world could look like, watch them.
You mentioned some deeply troubling health statistics. For example, during the pandemic, people with intellectual disabilities were 6 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than their non-disabled peers, or that they also die on average 20 years sooner than their counterparts for preventable reasons. Unpack some of that for us. I was completely unaware of that. Describe some of that for us.
Well, I think here's the raw and sordid and painful truth. Most of us don't think people with intellectual disabilities matter as much as other people. So when the line got formed for people to get COVID vaccines when they came out, our athletes were not at the front of the line. Our community wasn't prioritized, even though their vulnerabilities were enormously higher. When it comes time for dental health or getting eyeglasses or having other kinds of preventative, our community is not prioritized. Insurance doesn't prioritize them. Medical training doesn't prioritize them. Government insurance and reimbursement schemes don't prioritize them. So there's this deep, almost systemic, you might say. I don't like to use that language too often, but there's this deep sense in which this population just doesn't matter as much. And the outcome of that is loss of life. That's it. That's simple, straightforward. People die younger. They die preventably. Their disabling conditions are made worse, even when they could be made better, because of those forms of neglect. So this is, we hear a lot, and we should hear a lot about other communities who are unfairly treated by healthcare, or education, or employment. This is just one of those communities that typically isn't on the agenda. And so part of the Special Olympics movement's challenge has been to take the goodwill people have towards our movement and invite people to take that goodwill and make real systemic changes in whatever it is, public policy. If you're a business and you hire 15 or 20 people, maybe you might consider hiring one person with an intellectual challenge. It'll make your business better. If you're a school, consider making sure that kids with special needs are welcomed in your school. It'll make your school better. If you're a doctor, care for people with intellectual disabilities. Might not make you richer, but it'll make you a better doctor. So, that's part of our message to the world now as that movement works in health and in education and in some of these areas to invite us to see this community of human beings more fully, and by seeing them more fully, include them more justly.
Another endeavor that you've worked with is the nonprofit Unite that's pioneered the Dignity Index, which is a fascinating initiative. Describe that one for us.
Well, look, the main insight of the Special Olympics movement is that when you treat people with dignity, you get the best out of people on all sides. There's no Republicans and Democrats at the finish line serving water at Special Olympics events. There's no rich or poor. There's no CEOs versus frontline workers. If you're serving water at a Special Olympics track meet, you're serving water because you're blessed. You're blessed. And it, by the way. It. I never met a person who didn't. So the volunteers get treated with dignity. They treat the athletes with dignity. And, beautiful things happen. So, a few years ago, I was looking around the country. People were saying, oh, no, this country sucks and they suck and they're terrible and they're the problem and we ought to get rid of them. And I was like, wait a minute. Hold on. That's not the country I see. So, when I stepped down from the day-to-day job at Special Olympics, I love the movement, but I wanted to how could I teach or how can I get people to see what we see at those events in our public life, like in the way in which, like, we led a campaign at Special Olympics to ask people to stop using the word retard to make fun of other people. And for the most part, it worked. Most people don't use that language anymore because it's humiliating. I mean, of course, you can use it if you want. I have no policing authority, but I can just say it's humiliating for people. Try a different word. But that message that we can change our language actually changed people's hearts. So the dignity index, here's what it comes down to. We're treating people with contempt. We don't have a difference of opinion problem in our country, just like we don't have a difference of opinion or a difference of skill problem at Special Olympics. What we overcome at Special Olympics is contempt, is dehumanization, because we meet and we listen and we try to understand the gift of the other at the special. So I said, well, let's do that in culture. And people say, well, you can't do that, and anyway, nobody would get rewarded if they did. So that's why we built a scoring tool. So we could actually tell you, we could score you, not as a person, but when you speak. If I say, you're on the other side of this political issue, I'm better than you, you're wrong, you're a jerk, I can score that. That's a 3 on the scale of 1 to 8. That's getting down close to you're evil. And that's even just a hair's breadth above you don't deserve to have your humanity protected. I can also say we don't agree on an issue. I want to understand your point of view more deeply. And as I seek to understand it, I want you to know one thing. I'm going to treat you with dignity no matter what. I'm not going to necessarily agree with you. And I'm not necessarily going to support your point of view, but I will not violate your dignity.
Yeah.
So this dignity index is just a little tool that helps in one small thing, which is how you treat people when you disagree. Just that. That's the only thing we're trying to focus on. How do we treat each other when we disagree? And at that, it turns out, is quite a powerful question. When we ask audiences, we invite audiences to ask it of themselves. We don't tell you, hey, you're doing a good job, you're doing a bad job. We just invite people to explore it. And they go, wow, never thought of it that way. I can do better. Most everybody says that.
Did you have any surprising experiences working with those who put the index together or training others? What any episodes in which you thought, okay, I see how this could be helpful.
So many, honestly. I was talking to a young woman the other day, just a college graduate, and she's very progressive. She got trained in how to use the dignity index, and she really lost her relationship with her grandmother over the reproductive rights question. She was strongly pro-choice and her grandmother strongly pro-life, and they just couldn't talk about it anymore. And she said, I'm learning that I could talk to her. I don't have to agree with her, but I can talk to her and treat her with dignity. So she had a conversation. She listened, and she kept asking more questions. And her grandmother finally said to her, look, if you really want to know, honey, let me tell you my story. And then she described having an unwanted pregnancy at a very young age, and making the decision 50 years ago to keep the pregnancy. And the pregnancy, it turned out, was this young woman's mom. Now, as she came back, the young woman came back, she's still pro-choice. Didn't change her. But my God, did it strengthen her relationship with her grandmother. And even though they still sit on opposite sides of a very difficult and painful issue, they now, at least from this young woman's point of view, looks at her grandmother with deep love and with an appreciation of where she comes from. So, I just feel like that we have so many of these stories. People learn about the dignity index and they come back and say, I was having such a hard time with my husband. My wife was driving me crazy. And I told her, honey, we've got to use the dignity index when we, and fun. And people laugh about it. And then all of a sudden, many times there's a little breakthrough, there's a little breakthrough here. Oh, I see what you mean. So it's kind of like, it awakens conscience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It awakens It awakens, we call it the mirror effect, because we designed this to score politicians. We thought, if we can score politicians, then we'll kind of bludgeon them into being better.
little pro-social shame there.
Yeah, a little pro-social shaming. That was a little bit the idea at the beginning. But what it's turned out to be is what we call the mirror effect. People don't actually lose interest in judging other people. They actually want to work. They want to use this for themselves. They're like, oh, wait a minute. I'm part of the problem. You can't believe when I say this to I come from a Democratic family, and I go to family gatherings or parties, or most of the people are from my tribe because that's the way we live. And I say, well, guess what? We're a big part of the problem. We are. What do you mean we are? They are the problem. And I'll go to a presentation in a bright red place or with a bright red group, and I'll do the presentation. This is great. This is great. But we're not the problem. They're the problem. And we can't unilaterally disarm because those liberals are going to come after us with their hateful contempt. So all of us have this. We like to say contempt operates by disguise. It's disguised usually as self-righteous principle. But once you see it, it's like, oh, I see what you mean. I'm not just advancing my principle. I'm dehumanizing the person I disagree with. Ooh. Yikes, I see what you mean. And then the people are like, wait a minute, but they're so horrible. But wait a minute, it's true, but wait a minute, they've done horrible. But then we're all of a sudden, all of us are kind of launched into a new state, which is to sort of explore how we could do better. And that's, to me, a pretty exciting development.
Yeah. So given that kind of work and given the fraught realities of this American political moment, social moment, do you find yourself kind of wavering between hope and despair, or what's that like for you?
I don't. This is one of the reasons I wanted to create Need a Lift, this podcast, and, trying to learn from folks like you who have done such a good job with this medium, which is I want to amplify what I believe to be the tens of millions of Americans who are transforming pain into purpose, who are taking conditions where there's tension or fear or anxiety and turning it into meaning and purpose and value. There are millions and millions of us who are doing this. We don't hear from them. We hear from the squeaky, angry, hostile, contempt-based, devotionally angry fringes. And even the people in those fringes aren't really that bad, but their voices, when they're most hostile and most hateful, those parts of them get remembered. So we have a version question. Which version of us is true? Is it the dehumanizing contempt that we hear largely from the algorithm and from partisan media and from politics? Or is it the alternative culture of openness, creativity, resilience, connection, civic engagement that most of us see in the communities around us a lot of the time? My view is that's a much bigger story at the grassroots level, that the versions of our lives that most of us lead most days are much more hopeful than the narrative we hear about who we are from the top. So we got to elevate the stories of the change makers and the creatives and the healers and the brokers of injustice who do it without hatred. Like, my mom said, you can't use the word hate here. You can say you don't like your teacher. You can say you don't like your friend, but you can't say you hate. So this podcast is sort of trying to say, let's create a no hate zone here. And let's find the people who are changing the world from right and from left without hating and dividing and dehumanizing and treating people with contempt. I think it's hopeful, actually.
It does seem.
I think we're in much better shape than we think or than we hear most of the time.
Yeah, it does seem like the tagline of your new podcast kind of captures in many ways all of the things that we've talked about so far. You say you're interviewing, quote, wise people modeling individual and community change transforming some of the most painful moments in their lives into purpose, which is that's a great agenda to set out for a podcast.
Yeah, I'm just following you, man. I mean, that's what you're already doing. I'm just trying to add one more voice to the choir. It's not going to be me or you or one or two of us. It's going to be when people see, oh my God, everywhere I look, this is what I'm hearing. And then people will start to trust it a little more. And they'll start to recognize and name it a little bit. And that's what we're trying to do. Like when people, we just launched our podcast a couple of days ago. People are already texting me like, I got a lift, it worked, And so people are kind of excited about the idea that there's a place they can go to hear people who are doing the hard work, but doing it with hope. And, I'm going to say it, they're doing it with love. The people I talk to really work their entire beings into a space where they're uncompromising in principles. These are not nice people necessarily, but they do try to treat others with love, even in the face of very difficult circumstances.
Yeah. Your first episode was with Rainn Wilson, and who we've also had on our show. I think just that little snippet of that conversation points, I think, to one of the things that's this common thread through your work is that so many of us just want to have real human connections where we can just really talk about things that really matter, right? Those elementary school kids really want to know, why does this matter? And if it doesn't matter, then let's find something that matters. Yeah. And that beautiful kind of thread of being who we truly are.
Yeah. And I think the good news is your podcast, the generations of students you've taught, they're not alone. We have, people complain about the boomer generation, my generation, all the things we've done wrong. We've made a lot of mistakes, but we've done some things well. And I think the young people growing up today are more comfortable with themselves, more comfortable with sharing who they are, more comfortable with search, more comfortable with being open about their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And when I was a kid, it was almost like embarrassing to cry or to be sad. That wasn't healthy. We're healthier now in that respect. There's been some unintended consequences, and we've got to figure out what to do about them. But I'm really bullish on the future, and very confident that if we give license and language and community to people trying to lift each other up, we can do that.
Yeah. Is there any question that you wished I had asked you today that I haven't asked you?
Yeah, there's a question I wish you'd answered. Which is, what's the answer? No, I want to go back, if I can, just to the question you asked me, because you've explored this for your whole career. What do you think? What's the evidence that all this matters?
Well, I certainly was not prepared for you to ask me that question, Tim. Well, I think that I'm flashing to a conversation I had with a Buddhist who's a psychiatrist researcher who's done a lot of research on awe and the way they can now identify awe as a particularly, they can actually see it in functional MRIs in the brain, that it's a distinguishable emotion from other emotions, awe. And Dr. Keltner at Stanford. And he says that one of the, I think it's 8 different things that trigger awe are moral exemplars. And that this is one of the most significant ways in which we humans experience being moved to something larger than ourselves, some sort of reality that moves us in some sort of way to realize there is something greater than us that is worth giving serious attention to. And I think that for me, it is the story of great moral exemplars that has continued to pull me towards not ever being able to walk away from these sets of questions, right? It's the Dorothy days, even though, I've never even gotten close to living a kind of life that is exemplary like Dorothy Days was, right? It's the It's the Anabaptists in the 16th century who were willing to be persecuted and killed and burned at the stake because of the way they bore witness to nonviolence or not taking oaths and so forth. On and on and on, right? It's the Reverend King's and the way in which he did the work that he did in our country. And so there's something, I think that for me is a sort of tangible evidence. And going back to what you said, if I pay attention to the data in myself, that's part of the evidence, right? Because I feel this sort of awe in light of these incredible human beings and think, I want to somehow live a life that has that kind of freedom. I want to somehow live a life that has that sort of integrity. And which keeps me from, even in the frustrations and the anger and the questions I've had intellectually, emotionally about my own traditions, keeps me from walking away.
What a beautiful answer.
What about you?
In the presence of people who seem to transcend all the boundaries, all the expectations, all the fears, it inspires in you some element of awe that won't leave you, right? It just won't let you go.
Yeah.
And
right.
Look, I'm so moved I'm a little bit kind of like a pile of tears half the time inside about how beautiful I think humanity can be. I was at a little prayer service yesterday, and the guy got up and said, my friend just lost his 2-year-old child. He said, I don't understand it. My mom is 98. Why does she get to live? And that little baby didn't. And he said, there is no explanation. Life just is. But listening to him and then talking to his friend, and his friend seeing a shard of light break through the clouds and feeling like it was his child telling him, I'm okay. It just puts me on my knees. And that was just yesterday. In the face of so many ways to hear and feel that enormous, unspeakable grief, to see somehow that in the larger flow of things, my child is okay. And I can be too. And I can live even in the grief for that ray of light in my life. It doesn't take much to blow me away. And I feel very lucky that through some grace or some good fortune, I've been exposed to some of the moments like this almost every day of my life. And so I don't keep doing this work trying to help the country or, heal our politics because of some abstraction. I do it because just feels true. It feels like that's the truth. The truth is, even in darkness, there is a ray of light, and follow the light. Don't ignore the darkness, but follow the light. It's just, that's the way the world is. If the world has light in it.
Been talking to Tim Shriver, educator, best-selling author, New York Times bestseller, Fully Alive. He's also served for many years as chairman of the Special Olympics. I've been talking today as well about his most recent project, a new podcast, Need a Lift. Tim, it's been a beautiful conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the conversation and also for your good work in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and for your good work and for all. Thank you.
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.